Welcome to the Cycling in Alignment podcast, an examination of cycling as a practice and dialogue about the integration of sport and right relationship to your life.
Greetings and salutations, Space Monkeys. Before we begin our episode, a brief reminder that this podcast depends on support from the audience. The reason I am able to continue with this project is because of the support of patrons. If you are a member of my audience and you feel I have offered you insight or added value to your cycling journey, please consider a visit to my website, colbypierce.com, where you can make a contribution to the Cycling in Alignment podcast. You can support the show for as little as $8 for a one-time contribution, or choose to subscribe as an ongoing member. Thank you for your consideration. Here's your reminder to think critically, act intuitively, and pedal consciously. Accumulating presence. Boulder, Colorado. Status. Air quality, poor. Skies, partly cloudy. Crickets chirping. Today I went for a little bike ride. I was able to get away midday and go make a lap up the local Queen Climb Super Flagstaff, as it's known. The monster of Boulder. It's about 5K and change. I don't know how many thousands of feet, blah, blah, blah. I should probably know these things, but I don't, because I've lived here my whole life. Stats. And the last couple weeks I've been going up this climb in the middle of the week. And sort of made it a bit of a project just to see if I can go a bit faster. And in keeping with my practice of climbing and riding quickly with a minimum of effort. That is to say, to find flow rather than find output. Look for speed and rhythm rather than look for power. This is what I've been doing. And comparing my times on Strava from years past. I think the all-time Strava PR is something like a low 23 or low 24, something like that. And the best ever climb I did up Flagstaff Super Flag was around 28 and a half minutes. That was back in 2013, which got me on the third page of Strava or thereabouts. Most of the climbs locally, I could make the front page at my best years ago, decade ago or more. But Super Flag is more ridden than most other climbs, so it's got more times. And more fast people have gone up it. So the best I think I ever made it to was the third page. And so I went up it a couple weeks ago, not with any real ferocious intent, but again, just to establish a rhythm, see how things went, just kind of accumulate momentum as I progressed. And I ended up with a time in the mid 33s, I think, something like that. And then the next week I went again, and I made it to the 32s. And then it became sort of a goal. I was like, all right, let's see if I can keep chipping away at this. Let's do it for a few weeks in a row and look at the long game and see how close I can come to my old best time. And all things be told, probably have a little better gearing choices on my bike now. Bike's more or less the same weight as it was back then. It's probably a little lighter. I'm riding the Super 6 road bike. It's a pretty slick machine. And I weigh probably about 6 or 8 pounds more than I did back then. And all that is muscle, just about. I haven't gained too much blubber. And that's not a product of design, that's a product of just eating in accordance with my rhythms and not eating shit food and living a healthy life. So I'm about 64, 65 kilos now, somewhere in the low 60s, maybe high 50s, depending. On the day, I don't know how much I weighed when I set my fast time. I wasn't that good about tracking body composition back then. Notice that I use the term body composition and not weight because those are two different things. And the former is far more important to track than the latter. Because when we look at weight only, we tend to have a polarized response to heavy versus light. And I'll just remind you that you can, of course, gain weight and go faster because you can gain muscle and or lose fat. So in our weight-obsessed era of cycling, in our data-focused, number-focused mindset, we have to have a little bit of perspective, which is a good starting point to introduce the general theme of my thoughts for the evening, which is the contrast between marginal gains and what we might say is the 80-20 rule. And how these two tend to be in juxtaposition. And as a reminder, I think most riders are served by focusing on basic principles first, rather than comparing watts saved in chain waxes. This is the way. And so I went up the climb today with the intent of seeing if I could go just a little bit faster than I had in the previous 2 weeks. And I found myself having an experience of a bit of fatigue. I did on Sunday the Boulder Super Training ride. That's Project Super Training, which is a really cool ride that was started by a buddy of mine, a guy named Will Duggan. Will's a former pro. He used to race for Team Type 1. And his idea was to start a supported training ride where people would pay to go on the ride. And then all the proceeds would go to a charity. And the charity would change every month. And the ride takes place on the lunar cycle. And so this month's ride was a benefit for the White Line, which is the foundation that I believe was begun by the family of Magnus White, the young racer who was hit and killed here in Boulder. I believe it was last year around this time. Was it 2 summers ago? I'm not sure, to be honest. Unfortunately, we get this type of news much more often than we'd like to. And so I went to do this ride, and it was easily the biggest ride I've done all year. And this sort of sets the stage for the type of discussion I want to have, which is around how we tackle these types of events and how we manage our energy and output during these types of rides. And this was 200K door to door. My training stress score was around 350. And I haven't done many long races this year. Well, I've done one race this year, actually, Steamboat. which for the amateurs wasn't as long as it has been in the past. And so this ride was, as I said, significantly longer and harder than anything I'd done. And to be clear, I came out of it with a fair amount of fatigue, but I wasn't shattered, right? I mean, this is the basic principle I remind my riders of all the time. Tired is good. Thermonuclear wasteland is bad. The bigger problem isn't the thermonuclear wasteland rides in most cases. It's the chronic overdoing. It's really, really tired chronically. And the challenge is that people somehow convince themselves that this is normal and good and necessary in order to be better. And that's not actually how it works. What this results in is you being chronically tired. And rarely, or maybe never in some cases, performing to your potential. Because your expressed threshold or your expressed abilities are less than your modeled abilities. Because you're always trashed. And so this ride started out with about, maybe 60 people in the A group. And I happily floated in the peloton for much of the first probably 2 hours. And the route was relatively flat. And I'm pretty good at hiding in pelotons because I spent a whole career learning how to do that. That's the blessing of having a not so big engine in the pro peloton. You learn how to hide. And it gives you skills. And what do I mean by hide in the peloton? Well, I mean do an efficient job of monitoring my effort and load, watching what the peloton is doing, instinctively knowing when to match the pace or when to sag. That is, fall back within the group without losing contact during key moments, but still remain in the peloton. And also, of course, knowing when to be at the front and apply pressure. Although I was never really at the front for the first probably 3 hours. And the ride got quite heated at times. There were some rolling hills and the group came apart. And I applied all my ninja skills and stayed with the front riders just basically for fun until we hit the bottom of Wrist Canyon in Fort Collins, which is a pretty big climb. It's not terribly steep, but it is quite long and it does have some steeper pitches. Near the top, it's got some 10s and 11s, maybe a couple 12% grades for a bit. And when we hit the bottom of that climb, I intentionally just sat up and rode a very relaxed pace, knowing that most likely the group would regroup at the top, recombobulate, as they say, after your airport security line kerfuffle. And if for some reason the group left, then I would forge ahead and finish the ride at my own pace. But I was far from last over the top. And there were plenty of riders waiting and plenty of riders to come, even at my relaxed pace. Oh, I'm getting rained on now. Let's see how this goes. That was not in the forecast, so be it. And some people are having a party at the park. Look at that. How much fun is that? And so then on the way home, there was more playing and more animation in the group. And I did my thing and followed the group to the appropriate point. And then when the pace was forced once again on a long 3% grade, I let the group go, as did some others. And we made our own little pace line and picked up some shrapnel coming off the front. And then we got to the town of Hygiene. Yes, there's a town called Hygiene in Colorado. It's a weird thing. And at that point, I decided I was going to just ride really easy for the remainder. I'd done plenty of hard work. So I stopped and had a big cookie and a coffee and lots of water. It was actually an espresso tonic, which was really nice because it was a hot day. And I rode home by myself and went into recovery nasal breathing mode. I rode the last hour breathing 100% through the nose and just really focused on posture and relaxation, and effectively added an hour of recovery time on the end of my ride. And by the time I got home, I was certainly tired, but far from shattered. So, watching how other people rode that ride, it's quite easy to see how we get sucked into the pace and we feel that we have to keep up all the time. And I'm just here to remind you that that's not necessarily how you have to participate in a group ride. You can know your own limits, know your own fitness, and selectively decide to engage or not engage. And there's not going to be some eulogy that's read out like a lifetime CV when you die. People aren't going to be at your funeral and say, man, that guy was such a pussy because he sat up on the climb of the super training ride in September of 2025. Why didn't he just turn himself inside out to stay within 10 minutes of the leaders up the climb, which I doubt I could have even done had I tried really hard. And had I done that, which is a choice I could have made, I would have been for sure shattered by the time I got home. And that's just the level of fitness I happen to have at the moment. There's no shame in that. There's no defeat. In fact, I would offer there's the opposite. There is authority and power and command over your distribution of intensity, and also a bit of conscious thought in how you want to apply your relationship to enjoying a group ride. And I still had plenty of time to ride with other people and chat with them and be part of the group. And it was a really enjoyable experience. And I don't do too many road group rides these days because I do think that they're dangerous. They come with an element of risk. And the risk that concerns me isn't that someone else will crash me or that I will end up getting taken out in a corner or that I'll be embarrassed because I got dropped. I mean, I'll just take a moment to acknowledge, like, when you're 53 and been doing this a while, you kind of have the perspective to recognize that shit doesn't really matter. That other people judging you, perhaps, for your riding ability doesn't matter. But more importantly, I recognize that most of the people on that ride are just concerned with their own pacing and their own presence, their own experience. And this imagined stage of me being some rider who did or didn't stay with the lead group over whatever hill, none of that matters. It's just a training ride. And so this week, I went to ride up Flagstaff with the possible question mark intent of going a bit faster. And I got to the climb and feeling into where I was at that moment, I was kind of just figuring out that if I was going to go faster than I had the previous week, I was probably just recovered enough on Thursday for my Sunday ride to maybe handle that. And then I ran into a coaching colleague early in the climb. And we started having a conversation. Initially, I was going quite a bit faster than she was. But then we kept talking. And we rode most of the way up the climb. And she went a different direction, and that's fine. And then by the time I'd finished the climb, I'd realized that there was still plenty of work in my legs just riding up the climb at a conversational pace. And I will also point out that while I didn't have a focused effort where I was really trying to find speed and rhythm, my time ended up being about 36 and a half minutes. In the big picture, grand scheme of things, not really that much slower than the week before, where I'd actually started to put down a bit of effort. And that all ended up being the perfect ride. So I'm not doing this to carve my name into the history books. I'm not out there trying to win some Masters Award for local legend on Flagstaff or accomplish something incredible. I'm just there to have my own experience of riding, whatever that may be, to find my own rhythm. And in that sense, today, mission was accomplished. So maybe that's a helpful reminder that we can reframe things at any moment according to how we choose. And again, there's no lifetime CV of Flagstaff laps that people will reference at my funeral. Or if they do, they're probably not the kind of people who attend my funeral. Right? But all of that is the wrong way of thinking about it. The point I'm making is we need to take a step back and witness the absurdity of our own mental construct sometimes, which is the imagined stage upon which we count our own victories and we concoct this hypothetical audience that's viewing us and judging us and deeming us worthy of some great honor if we do amazing things. But if we just have an average ride, like a day where you just went up a climb today and you didn't do anything that anyone would find really that notable, at least by your standards, that is exactly and only precisely imagined. And for a bit more perspective, let's consider that there are riders who try their entire lives to ride that climb at the pace I rode today and will never do it. Likewise, there are also riders who will probably never ride that slow up the climb. So what? We make fences in our minds around what is acceptable and what we find to be permissible or to give ourselves permission to call ourselves accomplished. But these are just fences made of paper. We have local nemeses that we work to beat, maybe because they're irritating to us or because we perceive that they're not as talented as we are or don't train as hard as we do, and when they beat us, it rubs us the wrong way, but these are paper fences. And what concerns me is the rider who's at 32 and a half minutes or 30 minutes or 28 minutes or whatever, or 41 minutes. And these riders are often so fixated on marginal gains. They're looking for the edge. How do they go faster? How do we gain watts? There's an expression that raises my dorsal horn a bit. How do we gain watts? Like that whole concept is actually illusionary, right? You don't gain watts. You may produce more output. But really, we should be talking about gaining speed. How do you gain speed? How do you find better rhythm? How do you find less friction in yourself so that you can express yourself on the bike with more freedom, less internal inhibition? How do you learn to believe in yourself so that you can begin to make output in a way that uses all of your potential, your whole body, your elastic system? How do you find that freedom? Or maybe the relevant question for you as the audience is, what's preventing you from finding that freedom? What belief is preventing you from finding your own best pace, your own best rhythm? Open question. So many people are out right now. It's a very active evening. There's a lot going on. This is, we might say, the start of the Indian summer. It's that time of the year where the nights get sometimes a bit cooler, but at the same time, seasonally, we've got a different flavor to our training, a different type of base. In the spring, things feel different. When you do hard efforts and you deplete yourself, there's a sense of building. There's a sense of future anticipation of the race season coming and the efforts, the long rides, the races, the intervals, the group rides. But now, those days are numbered and the light is at the end of the tunnel. But also we have months and months of riding in our legs, months of throwing the leg over the top tube. And this ideally leads to a slightly different perspective. Assuming that you have had a somewhat normal trajectory in your spring and your summer, which is building and building, and then executing the gains that were earned in the early winter, or rather the late winter, and the early spring and the spring and the early summer. And then we've had many moments of intensity normally. Now my personal wave of that type of seasonality is less extreme than it has been now at this point in my career, because I just don't follow that wave quite as clearly. But the same wave is present. And so now if I am a little bit tired on a ride, the sensations are different. When you're gaining fitness and when you're not as in shape and you get tired, there's some sort of sense of building or reserve that you can tap into at times. Of course, you can go too deep and go beyond the capacity for those reserves to recharge, at least temporarily. That can happen at any time of year, but what I'm saying is now in Indian summer or fall, I don't know if Indian summer is a PC term. That's just how I know it. But Native American summer? I don't know what you call it. I'm not sure if that's correct. I have to research that, I guess. But late summer, that's probably the best way to say it. There's less of a reserve when you go beyond. And there's also less need to go to that same depth because you've already done the work. You've already built the top end that you're going to build. And so the objective becomes not to continue to raise the ceiling, but to simply touch those points of intensity. And then if you are still competing or are still doing hard things, long rides, long races, you distribute what you've earned at the right moment. It's like when the bank account's a little depleted at the end of the month, but you still have to pay for the right groceries. You're saving a bit of money for the precise moment that it's needed. And you're not quite as quick to be frivolous with the gourmet purchases, perhaps. I suppose that would be an analogy. And if you're in tune with that rhythm, it all works. It all makes sense. But if you ignore it, then you can put yourself in the box pretty hard, pretty quickly. And sometimes you don't come out. I've done this in previous seasons where I've gone too deep at this time of year and basically not really ever had reserves. And what I mean by that is you get to a hard race or a hard ride and you've got a couple of good efforts in you that can match your spring power or your summer power, and then the bottom falls out and you just sort of suck. This is something that nearly every rider will experience eventually. You hit your seasonal reserve limit, I guess you could call it. SRL. Try to keep up with the acronyms. And this is simply being in touch with the annual rhythm. And if you're a rider who's been around in the sport for many, many years, there's a life cycle to cycling or sport, which is sort of the same thing on a much bigger level. As a masters athlete, anyone north of 40 who's been doing it for a while, or certainly north of 50, this type of rider knows that they have to distribute their intensity with caution, right? They have to distribute their efforts at just the right moment. And they even learn to do this in the spring to some degree, holding the cards at their chest. Unless, of course, they're just hell-bent for leather and are under the belief system or programming that everything should be harder all the time. This is a thing that some people are spellbound by. These people tend to run into problems. They tend to experience challenge. Not always, but as a general rule. So, for those riders who are still thinking about marginal gains and racking their brains over how they can earn more watts or optimize their equipment, I'm not here to tell you that's a bad use of time or a poor decision. I mean, it's fun to dork out on stuff sometimes, right? And for those athletes who are highly competitive and really want to advance their placing at the next national championship or Masters World Championship or Elite National Championship, whatever your gig is, or state championship, of course, the sport is highly competitive, and cycling is a sport of details. You know, things like tire pressure matter. Things like chain lube matter. And there's also the flip side, which is cultivate and harvest your energy towards the principles that really matter first. And I would offer that for most amateur athletes, they are perhaps, what's the saying? Tripping over dollars to pick up pennies. Ignoring some of the most basic concepts, the fundamentals. How do we build a foundation of health that supports our best athletic practice? How do we remain centered in our practice of sports so that we aren't overly preoccupied with too many minutiae, concerned with details that won't matter if we neglect the big things, like sleep, just eating very simple, high-quality food that agrees with your phenotype or your biological makeup. It's been a lifelong practice for me to figure that out. And I'll tell you that my formula now is incredibly simple. The closer I am to racing and the harder I'm racing and training, the more I eat, this is going to sound absurd, steak, pasta, and a little bit of vegetables with olive oil and sea salt. That recipe almost never lets me down. Well, I can't think of a time when it has. And I'm simply manipulating the quantities of each of those substances based on how much muscle soreness I have versus how much work I've done. So bigger load, more submaximal load, more pasta. Harder, sharper efforts, more strength, more steak. It's really not rocket science. And I personally have figured out that if I skip even one meal, it puts me in the box for at least 24 hours. Now, when I'm not training much and I'm working a lot, I can get away with not skipping lunch, but having a very light lunch, something on the go. But if I'm trying to train hard in the coming days and I do that, sometimes I'm just straight up empty. Sleep and good food are essential for me. And I have a suspicion that a lot of riders are in the same boat. They just maybe haven't figured it out yet. Now, I'm not saying steak and pasta are the perfect formula for everyone else. They're probably not. What you eat precisely depends on your makeup. And certain foods will agree with you and be disastrous for someone else, right? Everyone has their rocket fuel and their kryptonite. So kryptonite for me would be a salad and chicken breast. Kryptonite for me would be a bowl of oatmeal in the morning and nothing else with it. Too high glycemic. Kryptonite for me is kale. Kale is straight kryptonite for me. Pretty much avoid it at all costs. And these are things you learn. Diet is also, to some degree, a sport of details. So know your kryptonite. Know your rocket fuel. And be uncompromising in your need for those things when you're training hard. It's just the cost of doing business. It shocks me how many times people go to races, especially the biggest races of the year for them, and they haven't planned out their final race meal the evening before. If I'm traveling to a race, if I have any control over it at all, I will bring all my food. It is by far the best way to isolate that variable and knock it out of the park. But when you go to a restaurant, especially in a strange town, and you don't know what you're going to get, that's putting months of work at risk. And so this is what I mean when I say that we're potentially ignoring the 80-20 rule at the expense of details. Because when you occupy your brain with chain lube and agonize over whether you should put on a 32 or a 34 tooth cog, but you fail to plan the last 3 meals before your race carefully or control them, and you end up eating at a Denny's or a Taco Bell, well, you've just tripped over dollars to pick up pennies. Prioritize the things that will actually give you the foundation for solid performance. And the rest is details that will work themselves out. And for some riders, those details might be different. In my estimation, probably about 2% of the human population has the genome SNP that allows them to sleep less than 7 hours a night and still be completely recovered. But probably 22% of cyclists think they have that gene. So it's kind of like When Harry Met Sally. Like, all the men think that the women they're sleeping with have orgasms, and all the women are saying that they don't always have orgasms, so you do the math. Same idea. Open question. In what areas of your life are you ignoring or refusing to look at some of the most fundamental principles that you know will help your performance? Big ones I can think of at the moment would include diet, sleep, a basic mobility program that involves maintaining or improving the basic range of motion of all of the joints of your body. Here's a concept. If your range of motion for a given joint sucks, let's say your hips are really inflexible or your hamstrings are really inflexible. First rule is you've probably told yourself it doesn't really matter for bike riding. This is incorrect. If you can't straighten your knees and have a reasonable forward bend, by reasonable, I would say, I have to be a bit careful with this one because some people have really long legs, right? So someone with really, really long legs and a short torso may not be able to touch their fingers to the floor, but their hamstring motion might be perfectly adequate. So I can't really generalize this one, but I'll also say that if your hamstring mobility sucks and you know it, then you know it. Or your hips, your hip flexion. But it's not just your legs and glutes and hamstrings that we're talking about. It's not just the front of your hips. It's your core function. It's your shoulder range of mobility. It's your neck. And as cyclists, it's so easy to just focus on the lower body. Stretching consists of reaching for your toes and maybe pulling your ankle back towards your butt, and you're done. And this is way too simplistic. So when we are expressing full range of motion of the joints, then we have the ability for our psyche to safely inhabit and operate our body. And when the psyche can move with intent towards a goal, and the body or nervous system allows this to happen, then we know that you feel safe to move. And if you feel safe to move in a large range of motion, then you're going to feel safe to assume the cycling position and put out a lot of output for many hours. As well, or additionally, you're going to be able to go around corners, drive a bicycle properly, see correctly, hear a crash when it happens in the peloton ahead of you, feel the texture of the road proprioceptively in your hands and feet. So what I'm suggesting is when people train super hard all the time, but they can't do a simple figure four stretch without immense amounts of pain, they are tripping over dollars to pick up pennies. When you're telling yourself that you have to go train more and that you don't have time to do any mobility, this is incorrect. And then you spend the evening surfing Instagram looking at videos on, I don't know, how to improve your VLA max or how to jam more grams of carbs down your mullet. And then your race is severely disrupted, or your performance is perhaps even arrested by adductor cramps, you're tripping over dollars to pick up pennies. Ensuring your bike fit is within your normative ranges, not critically normative ranges of the general population, but your normative ranges. Looking after details like equipment, like the condition of your cleats, right? Inspecting your saddle once in a while, making sure that it's not bent or warped. Making sure your handlebars are straight. These are non-trivial details that can really influence how you perform on the bike. And again, if you spend all night waxing chains, it's just the easiest marginal gain thing to pick on. But you haven't done anything to improve your hip mobility in weeks. Well, you know what I'm going to say. I won't repeat it. So, open question. There are named 3 things only: sleep, food, and joint mobility. Another one would be strength. Is your force ceiling so low because you've been riding bikes for so long and you haven't lifted anything heavy in so long that your capacity to generate peak force has declined, such to the point that you feel like you're pushing as hard as you can on the pedals at threshold? I'll make this blanket statement. If you think your force is maximal when you're at threshold for more than 10 minutes, you need to improve strength. You should at any moment be able to at least do a few seconds of acceleration that are significantly above threshold pace. Now, whether or not your system can recover from that is a different story. But if you can't even generate that force, you are not strong. You are actually quite weak. This is one of the biggest challenges with cycling. Over time, it will erode your force ceiling, your capacity to produce maximal force, and you will become quite weak. It's actually pretty impressive how weak some cyclists are. I've noticed this in myself over years, and that's why I've worked so hard to gain some basic level of body strength. You should be able to do a pistol squat, or if you don't have the ankle mobility, at least a few reps of shrimp squat quite effectively, with perfect form, without excessive medial collapse. This is a baseline strength assessment for cyclists, and many of them cannot pass this. And yet they're riding hours and hours and hours a week and doing intervals. You can't really add strength to a crooked tower. That analogy doesn't make sense. Let me see if I can reword that. If the system is faulty in how it delivers force, then adding strength to that faulty system won't gain you anything. You can't just put strength on top of a poorly orchestrated structure. First comes alignment, then we add strength. So what I'm saying is, don't just go out and try to do a bunch of pistol squats to fix a bad pistol squat. We have to break it down into its elements. And then we have to ask, why is the nervous system not feeling like it can deliver force in this way? A pistol or a shrimp squat replicate a lot of the demands of cycling, at least the concentric phases. Eccentric is another story. But I would argue that we should be robust enough to handle at least some eccentric load in these movements. So now we've got 4 categories that I've named: sleep, food, joint mobility, and strength. But here we're thinking mostly about the body as a vessel. And I would offer that the driver of all of these is, of course, the psyche. And the psyche follows the North Star of the dream or goal or objective of the athlete. And when our psyche is in alignment with that goal, then forward momentum follows. Progress will happen. We will progress towards that goal. But we have to be clear about what we're trying to accomplish and the why. And you've heard me say this before, but we have to be crystal clear about our why. Why are you doing what you're doing? I would offer that at any moment we should be able to clearly explain the precise reason why we race. And if you tell me it's because you want to find your own limits, well, I would ask, what exactly does that mean? Because science has proven to us many times that limits are based on circumstance. So it's kind of nonsensical to say you're going to find your limits. What do I mean by this? Well, if I put you in a race with 8 people that are just a little bit better than you, and you go racing up a climb, and you turn yourself inside out and get 8th, you might say, I found my limit on the day. It was as hard as I could go. And you might come to that conclusion because all 8 of those riders are just a little bit faster than you. So maybe you got beat by a little bit, and you crossed the line and you were exhausted. But there's a psychological element to this construct. So we're assuming that you had some idea that these riders were a bit better than you. Maybe you just upgraded from 3 to 1-2s. And so you find 8th place to be acceptable. But now what if I told you that all these riders began racing a month ago, and you've been doing it for 8 years? What if I told you that if you got 7th instead of 8th, you would win $100,000? What if I told you that there was a hand grenade in your living room and it would go off unless you got 7th place? This is a rather bizarre thought experiment, but I think you see where I'm going. Another example of this is the 98-pound grandma who's never lifted a weight in her life, but can suddenly lift the weight of a car off of her grandchild when it begins to roll towards him or her and crushes their foot in a parking lot. This is a story we've heard. Folklore, perhaps. Urban legend. But we've heard it more times than urban legend alone will explain. People can possess superhuman strength given the right circumstances and the right belief. When nothing else matters, the nervous system shuts off and life or death occurs, we can dig deeper. This gets into the Timothy Noakes concept that pain is a construct. It's an emotional construct. And pain is a signal that the mind interprets. I mean, have you ever been having a really good day on the bike and you felt like you were crushing the pedals and you were dropping people all over the place? And then another day in which you get dropped and pain becomes amplified, discomfort becomes amplified. This has happened to me many times. So it suggests that well, it does more than suggest. I would say it demonstrates that the pain we experienced is highly subjective and dependent upon our environment. It is contingent upon our surroundings. So all I'm really saying is, if we have clear intent and direction in our practice of sport, we can give ourselves space to have the best possible experience and outcome for our fitness or our abilities. And this is powerful because it allows us to express ourselves to the fullest extent of our abilities, which is what we're here to do. We're here to have the experience of riding up the mountain. We're not here to carve our names in stone as the winners. And it's so easy to get lost in that paradigm when we live in a world of glorification of Tade or whoever wins the race. Wout. But remember, these people, while they work hard and they train hard and they're passionate about the sport, just like you are, the gift they've been given was just that. It was a gift. And you have also been given a gift. The gift is the passion for your sport. The gift is your own drive to have your experience and see what it brings you. So when we're asking questions about our relationship with sport and we're considering our psyche, our drive, the relevant question is, what kind of experience do you want to have? Do you want to have one where you imagine an audience that judges you and shames you? Or do you want to have one which is filled with a constant sense of gratitude for the experience of playing in sport? Experiencing sport as training for life. My thoughts have reached their conclusion. Thank you once again for listening. I'm grateful for the people who let me know that this podcast helps them or is interesting for them to think about. I'm very grateful for the people who contribute to the podcast. It is expensive for me to keep this going, so your contributions are very much appreciated. And I'll remind you, as always, think critically, act intuitively, pedal consciously. Be well. Wisdom from the Tao Te Ching. Stop thinking and end your problems. What difference between yes and no? What difference between success and failure? Must you value what others value? Avoid what others avoid? How ridiculous. Other people are excited, as though they were at a parade. I alone don't care. I alone am expressionless, like an infant before it can smile. Other people have what they need. I alone possess nothing. I alone drift about, like someone without a home. I am like an idiot. My mind is so empty. Other people are bright. I alone am dark. Other people are sharp. I alone am dull. Other people have purpose. I alone don't know. I drift like a wave on the ocean. I blow as aimless as the wind. I am different from ordinary people. I drink from the great mother's breasts. Attention, well dippers. Did you know that I offer a unique service at my studio in Boulder, Colorado? An integrative fitting is the culmination of my experience and understanding that helps an athlete have a deeper insight into their relationship to cycling and movement. This is understood in the context of how the dream, goal, or objective aligns the client's choices and habits. The psyche, the environment, and drive will all influence the current expression of athletic ability. As we understand these factors, we can shape and direct athletic potential. What this means in a practical sense is that we spend about 6 hours working together, including a short or outdoor ride. We will film you on and off the bike, and we will discuss an extensive intake questionnaire. You will leave the fitting with a unique perspective on your function and with actionable pathways to improve your performance. This service was created specifically to help cyclists who have been through various fitting sessions and have had unsuccessful or unsatisfactory results. We dig deeper to find more meaningful outcomes. If you are interested in knowing more about an integrative fitting, please visit my website, colbypierce.com, where you can book an appointment. Epilogue. I want to share a few brief thoughts about the inception of cycling and alignment. The purpose of this podcast is for me to get 3.5 decades of hard-fought lessons out of my skull. Some of them through my own research and reading. Some of them I've been taught through mentors and colleagues, other riders, other racers. A lot of it, a massive amount of it, was simply trial and error through my own stubborn methods. And that has amassed a certain amount of experience and knowledge, understanding. And while I think I'm reasonably smart and I know quite a bit of stuff, I want to make it clear that the opinions that I share on this podcast are belief systems built on what I've experienced to this point. And that some of those opinions are pretty strong, but they are also loosely held. That is to say that if I learn more about a topic and have a greater level of clarity or understanding, then my old belief systems will be abandoned and I will now operate under that newfound knowledge. So I'm not here to tell people all the things that I know. I'm here to explain what I've learned to this point. And there's a big difference. Also, that is the intent when I discuss things on the pod with guests, is to learn from them and have a discourse. Because if we can't have a discourse as adults, then we've lost one of the basic tenets of modern society. Even if we disagree, we ought to be able to, in most cases, shake hands and walk away. Because after all, this is sport we're talking about, and while sport is training for life, it's nothing to get too upset over. The purpose of the podcast is to help me help other people, and specifically to help them actualize their highest potential by illuminating a path that enables alignment with their truth, their intent, and their coherence. That's really the end goal. So I'm grateful for your listening. My intent is also not, to be clear, to gain an audience or become popular or gain social status in any way. I don't care about that stuff. That said, if you feel an episode that you have heard will help someone you know, please share it with them. That helps us reach the end goal, which is to help more people. Thank you for listening. I'm grateful for your time and attention. Blessings.